She was just 26, a young reporter with big eyes and a voice that had never trembled on air. But on a quiet Thursday morning in Ouagadougou, she asked a question that would make her disappear. The microphones went silent. The room froze. 3 days later, so did her name in the news cycle. But what no one knew was that she had left behind a USB, and what was inside would shake the walls of power across Africa. On a humid morning in mid-June, inside a stark, windowless government hall in Ouagadougou, a press conference unfolded with the usual tension of tightly controlled media appearances under the administration of President Ibrahim Traoré. Journalists were seated in rows, flanked by plainclothes officers pretending to be observers, their presence unmistakable. The atmosphere was cold and measured, and though questions were allowed, few dared to ask anything real. "You young lady at the back, speak," said a man in a suit, scanning the room as though already regretting his decision. Awa stepped forward, her heart racing but her voice steady and clear. She didn't read from her notes. She looked straight ahead. "Can the president guarantee," she asked, "that no journalist will ever be arrested simply for telling the truth?" A moment of stillness followed. Then a ripple of discomfort spread across the room like a dropped stone in water. Eyes darted. A few reporters instinctively looked down at their notepads. The man at the podium offered no reply, just a rehearsed, plastic smile and a quick nod to move on. "Next question." That brief exchange never made it to the official broadcast. By afternoon, the live stream was edited, and by the end of the day, all mention of her question had vanished from the state news portal. Within 72 hours, Awa Diarra herself disappeared. No announcement, no arrest warrant, no official confirmation, just gone. Back at her one-bedroom apartment in a modest Ouagadougou neighborhood, the fan still spun above the kitchen. A sink held a few unwashed dishes. Her laundry swayed slightly from the balcony in the hot breeze. Her phone was found turned off beside a notepad containing half-finished story leads. Her social media accounts fell silent. Her news outlet issued a cautious public statement. "We are concerned about the well-being of our colleague, Awa Diarra. We urge the authorities to clarify her whereabouts." But no one responded, and few dared to press further. But Awa had not vanished without a trace. 2 hours before she went missing, she met her younger brother, Ismail, a university freshman with a love for music and no real interest in politics. They sat at a worn cafe near campus, the kind of place she had always loved, cheap, loud, and full of life. She barely touched her tea. She handed him a tiny blue USB stick and said only one thing: "If something happens, take this out of the country. Whatever you do, don't open it." He had laughed nervously, thinking she was being overly dramatic, but he took it. And as the camera in this story zooms out, we leave behind a half-finished cup of mint tea, an empty notebook, and a girl who vanished not because of what she did, but because of what she dared to ask. Ismail Diarra hadn't slept, not since the night his sister disappeared. The little blue USB she had given him felt heavier now, like it carried something more than data, like it carried her voice, her fear, and her defiance. He kept it taped inside the sole of his sneaker, close to him at all times, unsure what it contained but certain of one thing: someone would want it gone. He avoided the main roads. Government checkpoints had increased across Ouagadougou, especially around the universities and independent radio stations. Awa's name was no longer in the news, but people whispered. Students knew. Journalists shared glances of recognition and grief. A few even stopped Ismail to offer quiet solidarity, pressing folded banknotes into his hand. "For your sister," one of them murmured before walking away. Ismail knew staying in the city would be dangerous. His best chance was Mali. Awa had contacts there, exiled journalists and an old professor now working with a human rights group in Bamako, if he could just get across the border. On the third night after Awa vanished, Ismail left home with nothing but a backpack, a photo of them as kids, and the USB. He took a local bus to Bobo Dioulasso, pretending to be a student on break. Then, with the help of an old friend of Awa's, a moto taxi driver named Qasim. They made their way toward the border, traveling mostly at night, hiding during the day. The landscape changed as they moved westward. The city lights gave way to dusty plains and quiet villages. The silence between them grew heavier with each mile. Qasim didn't ask what was on the USB. He just said, "Whatever's in there, someone risked everything for it. Make it count." At a remote village near the Mali border, they waited for the right moment to cross. Ismail watched from behind a cracked mud wall as a convoy of military trucks passed. His heart pounded as soldiers laughed in the distance. He could almost hear Awaz's voice in his mind. "They control the narrative. Don't let them control the truth." Just before dawn, they made the crossing on foot through tall grass into Mali. No border post, no guards, just sweat, fear, and grit. And when the sun finally rose behind them, Ismail sat down under an acacia tree and held the USB in his hand. He didn't know what was inside. But soon the world would. Awaz had lost track of time. She didn't remember how many days had passed since she was taken, only the moments. The first, hands grabbing her outside her apartment. The second, the blacked-out vehicle with no plates. The third, the smell of dust and oil as she was dragged into an underground facility. Her cell was a coffin of flickering light and metal silence. No window, no clock, no explanation, just a single camera blinking in the corner like an unblinking eye judging her stillness. Food trays slid through a metal slot twice a day, each smaller than the last. No faces, no names. And every night the same man sat across from her in the darkness and asked one question. "Who did you give it to?" Awaz never answered. Her silence wasn't bravery, it was instinct, survival. Her mind clung to one memory, Ismail's confused face when she handed him the USB. That image became her anchor. When the lights in her cell stayed on for 72 hours straight, she counted heartbeats. When white noise pumped through the vents until her ears screamed, she recited poetry to herself in whispers. When they finally gave her silence again, it was almost worse. The emptiness gnawed at her. But then one night she heard it, a voice. Not a guard, not an interrogator, just a whisper through the walls, "Journaliste." She pressed her ear to the concrete and whispered back, "Yes." No reply came, but that was enough. She wasn't alone. Others were here. Other voices silenced, other names erased. They were the unseen casualties of truth. On her 12th night, she was led, without warning, down a long corridor to a larger chamber. Inside were 5 other prisoners. One she recognized, a radio host who had vanished months ago. Another, a cameraman she had worked with once, now pale and trembling. They didn't speak much, but when their eyes met, something passed between them. Acknowledgement, resilience, the flicker of resistance. The radio host leaned close and murmured, "They call this place the pit. It's where voices go to die." But Awaz wasn't ready to die, not yet. Somewhere beyond this place, her brother was running, and the truth, once buried, was already clawing its way toward the light. In a dimly lit backroom of a radio station in Bamako, Professor Salif Keita inserted the blue USB into a creaking old laptop. The hum of the fan filled the silence as he and Ismail Traoré sat side by side, waiting. Ismail's palms were slick with sweat, and his heart beat against his chest like it was trying to escape. A folder opened. Dozens of files, audio logs, handwritten notes, and one short video titled 17 Seconds Truth, MP4. Salif clicked. The footage was grainy. The camera was discreet, maybe a button cam or hidden pen, but the audio came through crisp and terrifying. A small, unadorned room. 4 men in military attire, one in a suit. Their voices calm, calculated. "The press will resist," one said. "Then we silence them," another replied. "Start with the loudest. Arrest them, disappear them, let fear do the rest." A pause. "And the president," another voice, deeper, colder, "he doesn't need to know every detail. The less he knows, the safer we all are." 17 seconds. Salif closed the laptop and looked at Ismail, eyes wide. This isn't just repression. This is architecture, systematic, coordinated. They acted quickly. Encrypted copies were sent to exiled journalists, international watchdogs, and a secure whistleblower platform. Within hours, the clip surfaced on dark web forums. By morning, it had reached major African diaspora news pages in France, Ghana, and South Africa. Then Al Jazeera. Then Reuters. By noon, the story was out. A secret recording reveals top Burkina Faso officials conspiring to suppress media freedoms. The world had been warned. And somewhere, in the darkness of the pit, Awadira stirred from restless sleep, unaware that her whisper of truth had finally found its echo. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou the next morning, the streets were quiet, but humming. Inside cafes and taxis, market stalls, and mobile phone shops, the same video played on cracked screens and glowing phones. Awad's name was trending globally. The phrase 17 seconds of truth had become a war cry online. Hashtags multiplied. Free Awad, the pit, voices will rise. Inside the presidential compound, panic spread like smoke. Advisors scrambled to issue statements, but none could agree on the tone. Denial, deflection, silence. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-leader once hailed as the people's hope, now found himself cornered by shadows he hadn't fully seen until now. He stared at a paused frame of the video. The face of his intelligence chief froze in mid-sentence. Traoré's jaw tightened. He said, "I didn't need to know," he muttered under his breath. But now he did know, and he had to decide, bury it deeper or burn the house to expose the rot. Outside the government walls, protests erupted, not in the thousands, but in waves of 10, then 20, then hundreds. Students marched. Journalists wore black tape over their mouths. Candles were lit outside the now-shuttered Ouaga Voice headquarters. Names of the disappeared were chanted like prayers. Meanwhile, foreign governments issued cautious statements. The African Union called for transparency. Amnesty International demanded access to detained journalists. A UN special rapporteur requested entry into Burkina Faso. The walls of silence were crumbling. Back in the pit, the guards had changed. They were quieter now, tense. Awad noticed that her food portions grew. The interrogator no longer visited. Then one morning, a man in civilian clothes opened her door and said only 2 words. "Get dressed." She was led up into sunlight for the first time in what felt like years. Cameras flashed. A car door opened. And there, standing across the compound, was someone she never expected to see, President Ibrahim Traoré himself. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, long and hard, perhaps to measure the cost of what had been done, perhaps to remember that the revolution he once led had not been for silence. Awad stood tall, her wrists still bearing the marks of steel. And in that moment in front of the nation, the silence bowed to her voice. 3 days after Awad's release, a national address was broadcast across Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré stood alone at a wooden podium, without military insignia or teleprompter. His voice, for the first time in months, carried no slogans. "I was misled," he began, "but I take full responsibility. Silence was not my revolution. Fear was never our vision." In a sweeping declaration, he announced the immediate suspension of all intelligence officials named in the leaked video, the formation of a civilian-led commission to investigate political detentions, and a full audit of clandestine holding facilities, including the pit. Most shockingly, he ordered the permanent closure of the pit itself. The streets erupted again, not in protest but in celebration. Bells rang. Drums echoed from neighborhood to neighborhood. Awad's face, once whispered in fear, now adorned murals painted across city walls. Children carried cardboard signs that read, "La vérité parle, truth speaks." Internationally, Burkina Faso became a symbol, not just of repression, but of resilience. The 17-second video was played during a UN Human Rights Council meeting. Awad Diarra received an award for courage in journalism. Ismail stood beside her, tears in his eyes. In her acceptance speech, Awad said only this: "A USB doesn't carry power, but the truth it contains, that does. And the truth doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone willing to risk everything for it." She returned to Ouagadougou not as a victim, but as a voice. She reopened Ouaga Voice with a team of former prisoners and new journalists from across Africa. Their first headline, a simple sentence: "We are still here. We are still telling the truth." And in a quiet office lit by morning sun, a photo of two siblings sat on a desk. One had run, one had endured, and together they had changed the course of a nation. The video hadn't just gone viral, it had ruptured the fragile surface of silence that blanketed the nation. In the following days, diplomatic cables flew between capitals. Embassies in Ouagadougou received evacuation protocols. Foreign journalists began arriving, some undercover, to document the unrest and investigate what had been done to Awad Diarra and the others. Within Burkina Faso, the political landscape fractured. Several high-ranking officials resigned or went missing. Others doubled down, claiming the video was fake, a foreign plot. But denials didn't stand a chance against the raw, chilling clarity of those 17 seconds. The people had heard, and more importantly, they believed. Inside the pit, guards rotated frequently, no longer barking orders or dragging prisoners to interrogation. One even whispered through the bars to Awad, "You did this." She didn't know what he meant, until 2 days later the door opened without warning. No chains, no threats, just a woman in plain clothes offering her clean clothes and a way out. The hallway to freedom felt longer than the one she was dragged through weeks ago. When she emerged into the open air, the sky above seemed both familiar and foreign. But it was the sound that hit her first, not silence but chanting. Hundreds of voices, outside the compound walls, calling her name. From a distance, someone ran toward her. It was Ismail. They met in a collision of arms and tears. No words, just breathless relief. Then, rising from the crowd, a journalist held up a microphone and asked, "What now, Awad?" She looked to the horizon and said, "Now, we report the rest of the truth." 6 months later, Burkina Faso was no longer the same. The pit was turned into a public archive and museum of resistance, its underground halls renamed after those who had vanished inside. New laws protecting journalists were ratified with overwhelming support. A national press council was formed, led, symbolically, by Awad Diarra herself. President Traoré, once a mystery of power, held regular public addresses and open forums. Though some called it rebranding, others saw something deeper, a man changed by the truth he almost never learned. He had not abandoned control, but he had surrendered secrecy. At Ouaga Voice, the newsroom buzzed with purpose. Former detainees became editors, student interns filled the halls, and a new section launched, Echoes of the Pit, publishing stories from political prisoners across the continent. Their first feature was titled, 17 Seconds That Freed a Nation. In the final lines of her editorial, Awad wrote, "Tyranny is not always loud. Sometimes it creeps in on whispers and shadows, but the antidote to fear is not more silence. It is speech, it is light, and it is truth spoken without trembling." And as she sat beneath the same sky she had once thought she'd never see again, she smiled. Because this time, the story was hers to tell. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on even more exciting stories. Every like and subscription from you is a huge motivation for me to keep sharing great content. Thank you for watching.